This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. If you click on the link in the description below, it'll take you to their store and they'll know I sent you there. Hi everyone, I'm Nizzahon, and today I'm bringing you a bonus video. I have finished giving my thoughts on every single individual card in Zendikar Rising, and I'm concluding Zendikar Rising Limited Review Week, as I usually do, with an Archetype guide. In this video, I'll talk about what each color pair in the format wants to be doing. This video won't really contain a discussion of the cards that are just the best ones around, unless they happen to have special synergy within a particular color pair. If you're interested in that kind of thing, that's what the set review is for. Alright, let's get started with the first color pair. Our first color pair is red-white, and like in most sets, we have a signpost uncommon for every color pair. Every color pair also has a rare, and a few of them also have a mythic rare, as you can see here. And these signpost uncommons are especially meant to sort of direct you in the direction that a color pair wants to go in, because obviously enough, they have both of the colors in a particular color pair. And this set has a lot of different tribal archetypes. There are 4 that are focused on one individual creature type and then also have a sub-theme, and then there's 2 that are focused on the new party mechanic. And so we'll be looking at these tribal archetypes first. So yeah, Kargan War Leader is a warrior lord. Obviously enough, you want to be playing a bunch of warriors to take advantage of that, and that is a very powerful effect if you can get enough warriors. You also have a signpost rare in Akiri, who is interested more in equipment rather than in warriors, but is a warrior. Akiri can make equipped creatures indestructible and draws you cards when you attack with equipped creatures, which is very powerful. And then you have Nahiri, who makes warrior creature tokens, can draw warrior or equipment cards from your library with her -2, and has a -3 that cares about the number of equipment you control. So the creature type for this color pair, obviously enough, is warrior, and the sub-theme is equipment. So from here, let's look at the common and uncommon payoffs for warrior and equipment. So obviously enough, we have Kargan War Leader, the lord that pumps all warriors. There's also Core Blade Master, who is both a warrior and an equipment payoff because only equipped warriors get the bonus that it offers, which is double strike. There's also Paired Tactician, who likes attacking with other warriors. And while it's not an obvious equipment payoff, equipping Paired Tactician is more likely to help it or its friend survive in combat, thus making it easier to get those counters. You have Resolute Strike, which is a combat trick that is both a warrior and an equipment payoff, because if you use it on a warrior, you get to attach an equipment to it at instant speed for free, which can be pretty powerful. There's also Expedition Champion, who gets bigger if you control another warrior. Then there's Goma Fata Vanguard, which is another warrior payoff. It makes creatures unable to block if they have power less than the number of warriors you control. There's Fireblade Charger, who's all about equipment, but is a warrior, and he seems pretty powerful. If he's equipped, he has haste, and when he dies, he deals damage equal to its power to any target, so obviously you want to put equipment there. There's also Relic Axe, which is an equipment that has a warrior payoff. It pumps warriors more. And suffice it to say, there's several good equipments in this set. I'm not going to talk about all of them in this video. They're not all warrior payoffs. But I did talk about them in my set review, and pretty much every piece of equipment that's in this set is at least fairly playable or better. So getting equipment for this deck won't be as hard as it is in most formats. What are the rares for this color pair? Well, we've already seen Nahiri and Akiri. There's also Kargan Intimidator, who can give warriors trample and makes creatures into cowards, which is good because cowards can't block warriors. And also, he's a warrior. And there's also Maul of the Skyclaves, which is pretty close to being a bomb. It's going to be good in any deck, but it will be at its best in this deck, which can get the most value out of equipment. Alright, let's move now to black-white, where the color pair is another tribal one. It's clerics in this case, and the sub-theme is Lifegain. In this case, you have a signpost uncommon and a signpost rare. The uncommon is both a cleric and a Lifegain payoff. In general, I think they did a really cool job of designing tribes in this set because they all have a sub-theme, and you don't have to go super hard into the tribe. You can also just have stuff going on with the sub-theme, and I think that's going to make these decks pretty cohesive. And Cleric of Lifespawn is an example where it's a cleric and a Lifegain payoff, and a really good one since you gain a life anytime a cleric comes down, and it gets bigger anytime you gain life, or the first time you gain life. And then Aura is a creature with life link that's a cleric that also has a cleric payoff ability that lets you return clerics with lesser converted mana cost from your graveyard to the battlefield when another cleric dies. So there are some cleric payoffs. You can see it's less of a focus in some ways in this color pair. We're going to see that gaining life is the biggest focus. But there are lots of clerics in this set, and the cleric payoffs they are pretty nice, especially Cleric of Lifespawn and Attended Healer. who can give clerics lifelink, and when you gain life, the first time each turn gives you a cat token. Expedition Healer gains lifelink if you control a cleric. And Relic Vial helps you drain your opponent anytime one of your creatures dies if you have a cleric in play. So, there's all these life gain cleric things going on here. The gaining life, ways to gain life, and payoffs for gaining life include things like Course Celebrant, yet another cleric who gains you a life anytime another creature enters the battlefield, or it actually. Marauding Blight Priest is a life gain payoff, makes your opponent lose 1 life anytime you gain life. Malakir Blood Priest drains life equal to your party number. Shepherd of Heroes gains you 2 life for each creature in your party. And you'll notice most of these are clerics. This one is not. Ghastly Gloomhunter is a zombie bat, but it does have lifelink. Mind Drain, this is a mind rot effect, but one that lets you gain life. Scion of the Swarm, another cleric that's also a life gain payoff. In this case, you get a +1/+1 counter whenever you gain life, unlike some of the other payoffs that say only once each turn. Zoff Consumption is one of the double-faced modal cards, and it drains your opponent 4 life, so this is a good place for it. So what are the rares for this color pair? Well, we have Aura, who we already saw. There's also Angel of Destiny, who's an Angel Cleric, who is a really weird card, but it does give you an automatic win condition if you have 15 life more than your starting life total and it has attacked your opponent. And it helps you gain all that life because it makes it so all your creatures basically gain lifelink. Your opponent will not gain or lose life when they get hit by it. They'll just break even while you gain a bunch of life. So if any deck can do it, it's going to be this one. Plus, this deck can really milk all of the life gain triggers. And Tabarax is a creature that can gain lifelink if it gets enough counters and gets bigger when creatures die, and has a cleric payoff that lets you draw a card and lose 1 life when a cleric dies. So that's black-white. It's both a cleric deck and a life gain deck. All right, our next color pair is blue-black, where it's another tribal color pair, about rogues in this case, but it has a mill sub-theme, and Soaring Thought Thief does an excellent job of conveying that, as most signpost uncommons do. The Thought Thief is a rogue, and it pumps all of your rogue's power once you get 8 or more cards in an opponent's graveyard, and you get to mill your opponent every time you attack. Every time you attack with 1 or more rogues, that is. You only ever will mill 2, even if you're attacking with 4 rogues. Make sure you know that. However, the point here is that you have this 8 or more cards in the graveyard thing going on, and that's something we're going to see a lot in this particular color pair. And I think it's a pretty cool design because frequently milling is something that just doesn't matter until your opponent's out of cards. But in this color pair and in this format, getting your opponent to 8 cards has significant benefits, such as pumping all your rogues with Soaring Thought Thief. So rogues and mill go hand in hand. It'll be interesting to see how often you actually mill your opponent out and how often you just kill them thanks to the advantage of having all of these 8 or more cards in the graveyard things active on your creatures. The rare for this color pair is a rogue payoff that lets you basically use ninjutsu, lets you put in the Zareth-san when you have an unblocked attacking rogue, and when Zareth-san hits the opponent, you get to put a permanent card from their graveyard onto the battlefield. So it's a rogue payoff, and it's not like saying, this is all about mill, but your opponent needs to have permanence in the graveyard for him to be at his best, and that won't be that hard in this color pair. So let's look at the common and uncommon rogue payoffs. So we've got our Thought Thief. There's also Sure-Footed Infiltrator. If you tap an untapped rogue, the Infiltrator, who's also a rogue, is unblockable, and when it deals damage to your opponent, you get to draw a card. There's Shadow Stinger, which can gain Death Touch if you tap an untapped rogue, and when it deals combat damage to a player, that player mills 3 cards. And you also have Expedition Skulker, who gets Death Touch as long as you control another rogue. There are a few rogue payoffs here, but milling has even more payoffs. So again, you have Soaring Thought Thief, which mills your opponent and is a payoff for milling. Lull Mage's Domination is a good card anyway, but if you can make it cost 3 less, it's going to be absurd, and obviously this is the deck where you're going to be able to do that the most. Merfolk Wind Robber is an early rogue that also happens to mill your opponent every time it hits them, and is a payoff for getting enough cards in their graveyard because you can sacrifice it to draw a card when you get those 8 cards in their graveyard. Ruin Crab is maybe the single most powerful mill engine in the format, and it will allow you to fill your opponent's graveyard quickly to make all these cards better. And if you're going to mill your opponent out legitimately, Ruin Crab is probably usually going to be part of it. Mind Carver is equipment that gets a lot more potent if your opponent has 8 or more cards in their graveyard. Namana Skitter Sneak gains +1/+0 when menace if your opponent has 8 or more cards in their graveyard. Namana Sky Dancer mills the opponent when it comes into play, in addition to being a rogue. Relic Golem can't attack unless your opponent has 8 or more cards in their graveyard, or block for that matter, and it can also mill things. Mind Drain is a Mind Rot effect, but it does mill a card, and on its own, it can contribute 3 cards to your opponent's graveyard, assuming they have 2 cards to discard, so that's worth keeping in mind. There's also Black Bloom Rogue, another rogue, and one that gets bigger when your opponent has 8 or more cards in their graveyard. Anti-Cognition, which becomes a hard counter that scries 2 when your opponent gets 8 or more cards in their graveyard. So these are the common and uncommon payoffs for this color pair. Then there's some rares that are well suited. We already know about Zareth San. There's also Nighthawk Scavenger, who looks at the number of card types in your opponent's graveyard. So the more you're milling them, the bigger it will be. And there's Maddening Cacophony, which all on its own can mill your opponent 8 cards and set up all those other payoffs that we saw. Our next color pair is Blue-Red, which has the tribal creature type Wizard as part of its archetype, but it also cares about spells, as Blue-Red often does. Umara Mystic tells us this pretty effectively because it says whenever you cast an instant sorcery or a wizard spell, it gets +2/+0 until end of turn. And there are a lot of cards that say that, and I think that's going to be sneaky powerful because we've seen effects that just say instant sorcery be really good in limited. Adding wizard means that like 10 cards in your deck can be triggering things like this, and it's not usually that easy to consistently make that happen, but I think it will be in this format. This Mystic will be a 3/3 frequently and larger sometimes. So I'm pretty excited about this archetype and how easy it will be to trigger these things. Kaza Royal Chaser is the rare, another wizard, and this one is a spell payoff and a wizard payoff combined because, well, I guess the other one was too, but you can tap it and you reduce the cost of an instant or sorcery by X, where X is the number of wizards you control. So it can drastically reduce the cost of spells. All right, so what are the common and uncommon payoffs for wizards and spells? We've got Umara Mystic, we already saw. There's also Expedition Diviner, who specifically looks at wizards, and if you control another one, it loots when it dies, which is pretty nice. Tazim Royal Mage has Kicker, and it's a wizard, and the Kicker effect lets you return instants and sorceries. Windrider Wizard lets you loot every time you play an instant sorcery or wizard. Rockslide Sorcerer lets you ping something anytime you play an instant sorcery or wizard. Salundi Vision is going to be at its best in this deck because you'll probably have enough instants or sorceries to have pretty good card selection with it. Umara Wizard is also one of these double-face modal cards like Salundi Vision, and it's also an instant sorcery or wizard payoff because it gains flying. You also have Relic Amulet, which lets you put charge counters on it and slowly accumulate charge counters on it, and then you can use it as a removal spell. So those are the common and uncommon wizard and spell payoffs in blue-red. There's also some rares, of course. We already saw Kaza, but there's also Magmatic Channeler, a wizard who gets bigger if you have 4 or more instant and or sorcery cards in your graveyard, and it's awesome that it can also help you draw cards. Seagate Stormcaller is a wizard who lets you copy cheap instants or sorcery spells, and this deck will probably have those. Master of Winds, it lets you, anytime you cast an instant sorcery or wizard spell, it switches its power and toughness. Well, technically you actually just get to choose 4/1 or 1/4. And it also draws you some cards. And obviously this color pair has a bunch of spells. I'm not going to show you every single spell in the color pair because, as usual, blue-red has a bunch of them. And that's going to make it easy to support this deck, as are all the wizard payoffs. All right, so we've looked now at the 4 tribal color pairs that are all about one creature type and then have a sub-theme. Now we're going to look at the 2 color pairs that are party. And party is a mechanic in this set that looks for you to have a nice mix of the creature types that we've already talked about: clerics, rogues, warriors, and wizards. And if you do, you can get some huge benefits. The signpost uncommon for blue-white is Spoils of Adventure, and it costs less the more people are in your party, and it gains you 3 life and draws you 3 cards. And there are 2 main party color pairs in this format. One of them is blue-white, and the other one, as we'll see, is black-red. And both of them have easy access to all 4 creature types, relatively easy. I still think it's going to be hard to consistently have a full party or anything like that, but these 2 color pairs are going to be the ones that are generally going to be the best at it. And the blue-white color pair is a little more controlling. We're going to see that a lot of the party payoffs in this color pair are on spells and, big splashy things you can do, whereas we'll see black-red is a little more aggressive with most of the party payoffs on creatures. Linvala is the rare for this color pair, and she's super powerful anyway, but if you get a full party, she then lets you detain a creature every turn, which is hugely powerful. All right, so what are the common and uncommon party payoffs in blue-white? Well, there's Allied Assault, a combat trick that gets more potent the more party members you have. Spoils of Adventure, as we already saw. Emiria Captain, which gets bigger when it comes into play the more party members you have. Journey to Oblivion, which reduces its cost the more party members you have, and it's a powerful removal spell. Kabira Outrider, which has an Into the Battlefield trigger that gets better the more creatures you have in your party. Practice Tactics, a removal spell that checks your party to decide how much damage it will do. Shepherd of Heroes, that gains you life for creatures in your party. Cascade Seer, which scries the more creatures you have in your party. And you can already see just on the second row that we have a Wizard, Cleric, and Warrior. Concerted Defense, a narrow counterspell that gets better the more creatures that are in your party. Seafloor Stalker, which reduces the cost of its ability to become unblockable depending on the number of members in your party. Skyclave Plunder, which lets you get better card selection out of a draw 3 spell the more members that are in your party. Seagate Colossus, which reduces its cost the more members that are in your party. And there's also Base Camp, which is good for fixing if you're trying to play party members in other colors and things like that. You can see overall that most of this stuff isn't super aggressive, with the exception probably of cards like Allied Assault and Emiria Captain. Those two are better for aggressive decks, but the rest of these are sort of, they're counter spells, they're card draw spells, they're more expensive creatures that gain you life and help you stabilize. So this color pair, for as far as parties go, seems like it's going to be a little more controlling to me than it is going to be aggressive. Let's look at the rares. So we already know about Linvala. There's also Archpriest of Iona. This isn't a card I loved in my set review, but if it turns out to be easy to make parties go, and if it's going to be easy for anyone, it's going to be this color pair for Archpriest of Iona. And if it's easy to make that happen, it does have a pretty amazing full party ability that lets you give something flying and +1/+1 until end of turn on every combat. Squad Commander makes more creature tokens the more party members you have, and also has a crazy full party payoff that makes your whole board +1/+0 and indestructible on combat every turn. There's Tazri, who decreases her cost depending on your party count, and also allows you to draw cards from your deck depending on, if you have Cleric, Rogues, Warriors, and Wizards on top. Nimble Trap Finder becomes unblockable when you play a party member until end of turn, and, like a lot of these rares, has a crazy full party payoff in this case, which makes it so all your creatures draw you a card when they deal damage to your opponent. All right, now let's look at the black-red party color pair, which is more of an aggressive deck. We have Ravager's Mace, which is all about making a creature scarier, giving it +1/+0, that +1 for each party member you have, and giving it Menace. And you also have Zagras, Thief of Heartbeats, reduces his cost depending on your party, and then has a bunch of keywords, makes your whole board have Death Touch, is a really, really scary card. So what are the common and uncommon party payoffs in red-black? Well, you've got Ravager's Mace. Then you have something like Acquisitions Expert, a little 2-drop that isn't really something that the blue-white deck has access to in terms of party. And this one lets you go after your opponent's hand depending on the number of party members you have. Deadly Alliance, a kill spell that becomes cheaper the more party members you have. Drana's Silencer, which is a better removal spell, enter the battlefield removal spell effect the more party members you have. Malakir, Blood Priest, another little 2-drop with the party effect. In this case, drains your opponent equal to your party count. You've also got Thwart the Grave, which is probably one of the better uncommons in the set, especially in this color pair where you will more consistently have a mix of these creature types and thus be able to reanimate 2 things pretty easily. I think most decks will be able to do it easily, but it'll be really easy for this deck. There's Ardent Electromancer, which pays you back mana depending on your party members. Grotag Bugcatcher, which attacks harder the more party members you have. Shatterskull Minotaur, which becomes cheaper the more party members you have. Synchronized Spellcraft, which does more damage to your opponent the more party members you have. Thundering Spark Mage, which deals more damage to a creature or planeswalker, depending on the number of creatures in your party. So you can see here, both of these color pairs, black, red, and blue-white, which are all about party, they can kind of go probably in any direction, whether they're more controlling, because, a black-red deck that's using things like Drowna's Silencer, Thwart the Grave, and Thundering Spark Mage is probably a more controlling deck. But this color pair also has access to a bunch of 2 and 3 drops with party payoffs. So I think more often this one will be the more aggressive one, and blue-white will be the less aggressive one. But I could see it kind of going either way with either of them. What are the rare payoffs for party stuff? Well, we already saw Zagras and Coveted Prize, which is another rare with an absurd full party payoff. In this case, you, first of all, would only pay 1 black mana to search your library for a card and put it in your hand. And then you would also get to cast that spell for, if it was, well, you can cast any spell in your hand with converted mana cost 4 or less without paying its mana cost after you do that. So that is powerful. So those are the 6 color pairs that are interested in looking at creature types on the battlefield. There's 4 more that aren't interested in that. And the one thing they all have in common is that they're green. We haven't seen green at all yet, and the last 4 color pairs are all green, and they're interested in doing other things. Even though there's some party cards here and there in green, it's just not as big of a focus, and creature types certainly aren't either. So blue-green's where we'll start first. It's a kicker deck and a ramp deck. Those things go hand in hand. Kicking things usually takes a lot of mana. Lowell Mage's Familiar embodies that perfectly. It is a creature who produces mana and gains you life when you kick spells, and it's going to help you kick spells because it gives you mana, so it works well with itself, and it works well in a ramp deck. Verazol is the rare here, a creature that is, you can pump all your mana into if you have a bunch of mana to make it huge, which fits with the ramp theme. But you can also remove counters from it when you cast kicked spells to copy them, which is going to be really strong when you can pull it off. So let's look at the kicker payoffs. We've got Lowell Mage's Familiar, which we already saw. Risen Riptide, which becomes a 5/5 when you kick a spell. Roost of Drakes, probably the kicker payoff that has the highest ceiling because it can just start cranking out 2/2 Drake creature tokens. And it has kicker itself, so it fits in nicely with the deck. Merfolk Falconer, which lets you scry 2 every time you kick something, in addition to very nice stats. Murasa Sproutling, which, if you kick it, returns a card with kicker from your graveyard to your hand. And Vine Gecko, which reduces the cost of kicker spells and gets a +1/+1 counter anytime you cast a kicked spell. So, those are the kicker payoffs. One thing that's kind of sad is that most of them are uncommon, other than Risen Riptide. And I'm a little worried that this deck will be kind of like the black-white deck in M21, which was really, really reliant on uncommons and couldn't come together that often. But it does look like fun. Uncommons aren't super rare, obviously, but sometimes when your payoffs are predominantly uncommons, it can be a problem. Let's look at the ramp and fixing in this color pair. Of course, we have our Familiar. We've also got Reclaim the Wastes, which also has kicker, so it fits perfectly well here. It'll help you splash things because you can search for basic lands with it. Roiling Regrowth lets you search up 2 basic land cards. You cash in 1 to search for 2, so you end up netting 1 land, but you get to choose which 2 basic lands they are from your whole deck. Vastwood Surge is kind of cool for this deck because it's both a good ramp spell, you pay 4 and get 2 basic lands from your library, and it has kicker. So it's both a spell that helps you ramp and something you can ramp into late because its kicker is no joke. It puts 2 +1/+1 counters on all your creatures. Tangled Florahedron is one of these modal double-faced card that's a mana dork. Scale the Heights, if you have the extra land to play when you cast it, and drawing a card will help you to do that, it will help you ramp. Springmantle Cleric, probably at its best in this deck because this deck looks like it won't have a hard time playing 3 colors or so, and I think you need to be doing that for the Cleric to be at its best. Let's look now at the rares for this color pair. We, of course, have Verazol. We've also got Coralhelm Chronicler, which both lets you look at the top 5 cards of your library when it comes into play and reveal a card with a kicker ability and put it into your hand, and lets you loot every time you kick a spell. Skyclave Relic, which is a mana rock with kicker, so it's good fixing, something this deck wants, and good ramp, and when you kick it, it gives you a bunch of mana and will probably trigger some kicker things you have going on. Myriad Construct, an artifact with kicker that gets a counter on it for each non-basic land your opponent controls when you kick it. It won't always come up, but I think frequently your opponent will have 1 to 2 non-basics, so sometimes if you have extra mana, kicking it will be worth it. You also have Inscription of Abundance, which is amazing. It's a very powerful kicker spell that's all kinds of things when you kick it, mostly a removal spell when you can kick it and choose all the options. Cragplate Baloth is kind of an ideal thing to ramp into because even if you have once you have an absurd amount of mana, you can play it as a 10 mana 10/10 with hexproof and haste, which is no joke. Lotus Cobra has a landfall effect that fixes and ramps you. Throne of Makindi lets you produce extra mana of any color for kicker spells. Tajuru Paragon has a kicker. This is one of the cards that sort of looks at party in green. There aren't a lot of them, but there are a few. And this one in particular lets you look at the top 6 cards of your library and pick one of these party creatures, or an elf, actually, from the top of your library when you play it. Usually if you kick it, you're going to draw a card. All right, so that's blue-green, all about kicker. Let's move now to black-green, which is all about +1/+1 counters. Our signpost uncommon here is Moss Pit Skeleton, When you kick it, it comes into play with counters, and once it's in your graveyard, if +1/+1 counters are ever put on your creatures, you can decide to put it on top of your library, which is pretty powerful when you can just guarantee you're going to draw a 5-mana 5/5 in the late game. Grakma is the rare, also very powerful. It's going to be a 3-mana 3/3 that replaces itself with a 3/3 token when it dies, at worst in most cases. And it also has a +1/+1 counter payoff, both in the sense that it likes other creatures that have counters, and it likes having counters put on it. And there's also Nissa, who isn't actually that +1/+1 counter focused. This color pair mostly is about that. But her -5 does put counters on a creature, so she does fit in with that plan. So let's look at the payoffs for +1/+1 counters at common and uncommon. So we've got our Skeleton. We also have Hagra Constrictor, a creature that comes into play with counters and gives menace to creatures that have counters, including itself. Oblivion's Hunger, a trick that is not very good in a deck that doesn't have very many counters, but if you get to draw a card off of it, it gets a lot better, and you will in this deck pretty frequently. There's also Gnarled Colony, a 2-mana 2/2 that can be kicked into a 5-mana 4/4 with Trample. And I think one thing that will really benefit this deck is that both Hagra Constrictor and Gnarled Colony, they're commons, and they're no joke as far as payoffs go. They're pretty good, because they both fill the role as cards with counters and cards that pay you off for counters, and that's pretty sweet. Iridescent Hornbeetle, also a powerful +1/+1 counter payoff. This one makes insect tokens at the end of your turn for each +1/+1 counter you've put on your creatures. So sometimes if you just kick a Gnarled Colony, for example, you're going to get a 1/1 at the end of your turn, and if you play a Hagra Constrictor, for example, you'll get 2, and so forth. So it's a very powerful effect. There's also Skyclave Sentinel. This is really the deck that's best for it, because this is the deck that can make it be an attacker without having to kick it for an absurd amount of mana. So you can just put a counter on it with various effects that are in this color pair, and when you do, it will have the ability to attack without having to have been kicked. Let's look at the rares now. So we have Grakma and Nissa, who we already saw. There's also Oran Reef Ooze, who lets you put counters on creatures you control when it enters the battlefield, a counter. And when it attacks, you put a +1/+1 counter on each attacking creature with a +1/+1 counter on it. There's Tabarax, who gets +1/+1 counters when things die. There's Skyclave Shade, who when it's kicked comes back with counters. Drana, she's going to be good in any deck, but her +1/+1 counters will have extra value here. Swarm Shambler is a pretty sweet +1/+1 counter payoff, because it makes it so if one of your creatures with a counter on it becomes a target, you get to make an insect token, so that's nice, and it can just keep making +1/+1 counters to put on itself. There's also Myriad Construct again. When you kick it, it can come into play with counters. And there's Crawling Barrens, a creature land that can gain counters, when you activate its ability. All right, so that leaves us with 2 remaining color pairs, and I've kind of lumped them together because they're both doing sort of the same thing and they work well together. And that is the Naya color pairs, which is all about Landfall. And I'm calling it Landfall Beasties because, as I noticed when putting this together, this color pair, these 3 colors, have very, very few cards that care about creature types and don't have classes or anything like that. It's mostly creatures, beasts, elementals, and things like that who just don't have that kind of creature type most of the time. And that's true of all of the landfall payoffs for these 3 colors, which sort of shows you this, Shard is sort of shunning all of the creature type stuff and focusing in on landfall, which is, of course, sort of a iconic ability from all the Zendikar sets. So you do have red-green and green-white, and they can have different identities. You won't always play them together. Red-green seems like it's going to be a little more aggressive. Green-white seems like it's going to be a little more mid-rangey. But kind of like we saw with the party creature types, there's going to be overlap there. They can do whatever depending on what you get. But the red-green signpost is Brushfire Elemental, a super aggressive creature who's difficult to block, who gets bigger when you play lands. And there's Phylath, who checks the number of non-basic lands, or basic lands rather, you have in play when you play it. You get plant tokens, and he has a powerful landfall ability that lets you put +1/+1 counters on a plant. Murasa Rootgrazer doesn't have landfall itself, but it helps you abuse landfall by putting lands into play at instant speed, and by returning lands you control to your hand. And Yasharn also doesn't have landfall, but searches up a forest and a plains, helping you trigger landfall. All right, so let's look now at the common and uncommon cards with landfall in this shard. So you've got the Brush Fire Elemental. You also have Canyon Jerboa, which makes your whole board bigger when you play a land. You've got Fearless Fledgling, which gets larger and gains flying when you play a land, and the size from the counter sticks around. McKindy Ox lets you tap things when you play land. Prowling Felidar gets a +1/+1 counter when you play a land. Akum Hellhound is a really aggressive attacker early because it becomes a 2/3 anytime you play a land. Skyclave Geopede gets bigger when you play lands, and it has trample, so that's nice. Spitfire Lagok deals damage to your opponent when you play a land. Canopy Baloth gets bigger. Kazandu Nectarpot gains you life. Skyclave Pickaxe is equipment that gives a creature the ability to have landfall +2/+2, kind of like Canopy Baloth already has. Territorial Scythe Cat gets a +1/+1 counter anytime you play a land. So, as you can see, none of these creatures have classes or any of that stuff going on that we saw in the other, certainly in the other 6 color pairs, and even in black-green and blue-green, we were still seeing creatures with classes that are, core cards in the archetype. Not seeing that here. So in addition to Landfall, there are ways to abuse Landfall in this shard. You have Tazim Raptor, which lets you return a land to your hand when you play it. That can also be used, by the way, to help you reuse a double-faced modal card that you played as a land earlier. Cleansing Wildfire lets you destroy one of your own lands to then search your library for a basic land card and put it onto the battlefield, and is a cantrip. That can let you trigger Landfall twice in one turn, which could be pretty potent. Pyroclastic Hellion, like the Raptor, returns a land to your hand, and when you do it, you can also do 2 damage to your opponent. Kazandu Stomper lets you return up to 2 lands to your hand, so more landfall. Nissa's Zendikar is a little more of a stretch, but if your opponent does kill the Zendikar, you do get the land back, which means you can play the land again and get a trigger. Reclaim the Wastes helps you search your library for lands, especially when you kick it, and you can make sure you're going to get landfall triggers on the next couple turns. Roiling Regrowth, we've seen it before. It's another card that can trigger landfall twice in a turn. Same thing for Vastwood Surge. So what are the rares in this shard? Well, in addition to Phylath and Yasharn, there's also Omnath, who is all about the landfall, and if you can trigger landfall multiple times in a turn, gets insane. But I think this color pair, or this shard rather, won't have that much of a hard time running him because it has access to so much fixing in green. So if you're kind of already in a shard deck that's, splashing red, maybe you're green-white and you're splashing red for like Phylath and a couple other cards, might not be that hard to also splash blue for Omnath. He is a sweet landfall payoff. Felidar Retreat is also a very powerful landfall payoff. Either makes your whole board bigger or makes you cat Beast creature tokens when you play lands. Kazandu Mammoth is a 3/3 that gets +2/+2 when you play a land. Lithoform Engine is an interesting card. It'll be interesting to see whether or not it's practical in this set. By that I mean, if this format is slow enough for you to activate this and get value out of it, that's great. But I do think it's at its best in landfall decks, because landfall generally doesn't cost any mana. So copying one of these triggers, like from Felidar Retreat or Kazandu Mammoth, is very doable, as opposed to trying to copy instants or sorceries or creature spells. That's a lot harder. There's also Lotus Cobra, who we saw earlier, who has landfall and helps you ramp and fix. Ancient Green Warden is sweet because you get to play lands from your graveyard, and it makes sure you trigger landfall twice every time you trigger it. I put Wayward Guidebeast here, even though it's probably close to unplayable in Limited. But if there's a deck for it, it's probably this one because of the fact that you get to return a land to your hand, and that means you can try to trigger landfall again. Valakut Exploration has a landfall trigger that lets you do the red impulsive draw thing, exiles the top card, and then you can play that card. And it's kind of cool that it also damages your opponent for each card you don't play that gets exiled by it, which is nicer than a lot of those cards. Morog is a crazy mythic rare that gives you extra combat phases when you play lands, and if you can trigger it twice in the same turn, you can get up to, 3 combat phases, and that's kind of insane. So, that's what Naya is about. It's about landfall. Overall, I think the format looks like fun. I think they did a good job designing the archetypes into, familiar but also interesting things, and I'm looking forward to playing the format. That does it for the Archetype Guide. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like it and share it so that others can enjoy it too. If you want to make sure you catch future videos, don't forget to subscribe. And if you're looking for the rest of the set review, you should see the playlist on your screen shortly. Also, if you want to see me draft this new format, I'll be streaming it this weekend. Make sure you're following me on Twitch if you're not already. The link is in the description below. Thanks for watching.